Coral Sea, The Hit. Yorktown is finished. May 8, 1942. Coral Sea, south of the Louisiade archipelago. The sky is bright and merciless, the kind of blue that makes every aircraft silhouette look sharp enough to cut. And on the flight deck of USS Yorktown, CV-5, the air stinks of avgas, hot rubber, and sweat trapped under steel helmets. Lieutenant Commander Butch Williams, one of the ship's air officers, stands near the island with his jaw clenched, watching deck crews shove aircraft into place like men trying to outrun a storm. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese carriers are launching again, and everyone on Yorktown knows the rhythm now. Scouts, then strike, then the long seconds where you stare into empty sky and wait for the specks to become death. Over the loudspeaker, the ship's voice barks headings and warnings. On the bridge, Captain Elliot Buckmaster is quiet, in the way commanders get quiet when there is nothing left to say that matters more than the next decision. You can hear the 5-inch mounts slewing, the whine of powered directors, the nervous slap of signal flags, and below the deck the engineering spaces throb as the ship drives hard into the wind to recover planes and to be ready, always ready, for what comes next. Then it arrives, the distant growl that swells into a full-bodied thunder, and above it the sharp, panicked calls from lookouts. Dive bombers, high! If you're standing on the deck at that moment, you don't see a neat formation. You see shapes falling out of the sun, wings flashing, and you feel the sudden smallness of even a fleet carrier when the sky turns predatory. The first explosions are close enough to shake teeth, anti-aircraft bursts, black puffs that mean the gunners are firing, that the ship is trying to throw a wall of steel into the attacker's path. Men press themselves against bulkheads and tractors. Others keep moving because stopping is how you die on a flight deck. A Japanese dive bomber, Aichi D-3A, Val, its fixed gear and gull wings unmistakable, drops into the plunge, and for a heartbeat it's almost graceful, like a hawk folding its wings. Then you see the bomb separate and tumble, and the deck crew's world becomes a single point of impact. The blast hits with a concussion that feels like the ship has been punched by a giant. Steel shudders. A column of smoke and debris erupts. Fragments clatter across the deck like hail. Somewhere, fuel lines ignite. Orange fire rolls along the planks where aircraft were parked seconds ago. Men shout for foam hoses, for stretchers, for damage control parties. Another bomb hits, closer, heavier, ripping into the ship's structure and sending a shudder down through the hull. Yorktown lists slightly, not a dramatic heel, but enough for experienced sailors to feel it in their knees and think, instantly, of the worst word in naval war: flooding. Below decks, compartments fill with smoke and heat. Damage control teams move into darkness with flashlights and breathing gear, shutting valves, rigging shoring, fighting fires with the relentless discipline that turns panic into procedure. On the bridge, reports come up in clipped fragments: casualties, fires, damaged equipment, and Buckmaster makes his ship do what ships do when they're wounded but still alive: keep moving, keep fighting, keep the flight deck working if at all possible. Out in the Japanese command chain, on the carriers that launched the strike, officers interpret smoke and confusion through binoculars and doctrine. They have seen American carriers burn at Pearl Harbor. They have watched ships die quickly when the deck becomes a furnace. And now, as Yorktown disappears behind curtains of smoke and evasive maneuvers, it is easy, comfortably easy, to believe the enemy carrier has been crippled beyond quick recovery. In war, certainty is a weapon you hand to yourself. Yorktown is finished. Yorktown won't be there next time. The men on Yorktown, coughing in smoke and stepping around shattered metal, don't have the luxury of that belief. They only have the next hose line, the next bulkhead to shore, the next fire to choke out before it eats the ship from the inside. And as the sun lowers over the Coral Sea and the battle's noise fades into distance, Yorktown is still afloat, wounded, scarred, and furious, already beginning the impossible work of staying in the war. Night falls on May 8, 1942, and the Coral Sea becomes a darker kind of battlefield, one where the enemy is no longer a dive bomber you can see, but heat, smoke, and the slow, invisible spread of damage through steel. Inside USS Yorktown, the ship is lit in patches. Emergency lamps, red battle lights, flashlights bouncing off bulkheads, while damage control parties move like ghosts through passageways that still smell of burned paint and cordite. In the hangar deck, soot hangs in the air, and every step crunches on shards of glass and twisted metal. Men in gas masks drag hoses through debris. Others wedge timber into bent frames, shoring up damaged compartments because the ocean doesn't need a second invitation. If a bulkhead gives, it will come in with the quiet force of pressure and drown anything in its way. Captain Elliot Buckmaster keeps the ship at speed when he can, but every knot is an argument between urgency and survival. Push too hard, and you strain wounded machinery. Slow down and you risk submarines. Or worse, you risk missing the next battle entirely. Up on the bridge, the night wind carries the smell of smoke away just enough for Buckmaster to think clearly, and the reports come up in the language of triage. Fire contained in hangar bay. Flooding controlled. Steering responding. Flight deck damaged, but operable. There's a strange calm to it, because Navy discipline is built for moments like this. You don't mourn until the work is done. In the wardroom, exhausted pilots and officers speak in low voices about what they saw. Japanese bombs falling like thrown hammers, the deck erupting, the way a carrier can feel immortal until it suddenly feels like a thin-skinned box of fuel and luck. But even in those murmurs, a question is already forming, the question that will decide everything in the days ahead. Can Yorktown get back into the fight fast enough to matter? Far away, at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz is assembling a response to intelligence that points toward a new Japanese thrust, Midway. The calendar is brutal. If Japan strikes in early June, there are only weeks to prepare, and the U.S. Pacific Fleet's carrier strength is already strained. USS Lexington is gone after Coral Sea. USS Enterprise and USS Hornet are available, but two carriers against what intelligence suggests could be a full Japanese carrier force is a dangerous equation. Yorktown, even damaged, could be the difference between meeting the enemy with a fighting chance or walking into a trap underpowered. Buckmaster knows that too. Every mile back to Hawaii is a mile closer to repair, and a mile that has to be survived. The ship's crew works in rotating shifts that blur into each other. Cut away wreckage, patch holes, rebuild the flight deck's battered systems, restore communications, stabilize damaged gear. The engineers nurse boilers and turbines, coaxing speed from machinery that has absorbed shock. On the flight deck, the crew clears scorched areas and re-rigs gear, because even a damaged carrier must be able to land aircraft. The ocean gives no refunds for planes that can't come home. On May 11th, Yorktown approaches Pearl Harbor, and the sight of Oahu's green ridgeline feels like a mirage until it sharpens into reality. Shoreline, gun emplacements, harbor entrance. Harbor tugs come out like escorts, small and busy, and as Yorktown glides inward, sailors on the docks stare at the scars, patched plating, burned sections, areas where the ship looks like it has been scraped by claws. Some of those dock workers remember December 7th, remember the harbor filled with smoke and oil and sunken battleships, and now they're watching a carrier that survived a carrier battle, an entirely new kind of naval war, limp back in with the next battle already looming. Yorktown ties up, and within moments the ship is surrounded by yard crews, officers with clipboards, welders, electricians, riggers. It feels like the ship has sailed directly into a factory. An initial inspection begins with brutal honesty. Damaged areas mapped, systems tested, elevators checked, arresting gear examined, flight deck integrity assessed. Someone estimates the obvious, 2 weeks, maybe more, because carriers are complex and the scars are real. But Nimitz's calendar doesn't care what normal repair time is. On the docks, You can feel the pressure before anyone says it aloud. Yorktown is needed now, not in 2 weeks. And in that gap between what's required and what's possible, Pearl Harbor's shipyard is about to attempt something that will sound impossible even to experienced officers, turning a wounded fleet carrier around in roughly 72 hours. Not to make it perfect, but to make it seaworthy and fight-worthy, just long enough to shock an enemy who has already written it off. May 27, 1942, Pearl Harbor, Oahu. Yorktown slides into the channel with her crew paraded in whites on the flight deck, not for ceremony but for control. Men placed where they must be, visible, steady, while the harbor that still carries the ghost smell of December's smoke closes around her like a workshop, taking in a broken machine. On the quay, Navy Yard officers and civilian foremen are already waiting with clipboards and hard hats, their eyes scanning the ship the way surgeons scan a patient, where the skin is torn, where the structure has been shocked, where hidden damage might kill later, even if the wounds look small now. The first estimates come fast and blunt, because honesty is normal procedure. The ship is badly hurt. Repairs could take weeks. Some say 2 weeks. Some whisper longer if you want everything perfect. But perfection isn't the requirement. Time is. Somewhere in the chain of command, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz has done the only arithmetic that matters. Enterprise and Hornet alone may not be enough for what's coming. If Yorktown can fight, even imperfectly, she must sail. The order filters down through the yard like electricity. Not 2 weeks, not when ready, but now. Make her fit to sortie in roughly 3 days. It sounds insane if you say it out loud, and the men who hear it don't argue because arguing doesn't move steel. They simply start moving. Yorktown enters dry dock the next day, and once the caisson closes and the water begins to drain, the ship's wounds become clearer in harsh daylight. Damaged plating, battered deck areas, scarred surfaces that tell you exactly where a bomb's force traveled. Workers swarm in numbers that make the dock look like an anthill. Welders, riveters, electricians, pipe fitters, carpenters, riggers, hundreds, then over 1,000, turning the carrier into an around-the-clock problem set. Steel plates are measured, cut, and fitted. Damaged sections are patched, seams welded, work inspected, then reworked if the fit isn't right, because even temporary repairs must hold at sea. On the flight deck, men grind and patch, restoring enough integrity for operations. Below, teams chase the invisible killers, leaks, damaged lines, compromised fittings, because a carrier isn't just a runway, it's a labyrinth of fuel, steam, electricity, and ventilation, and any one failure can make the next battle fatal. The clock rules everything. Floodlights bloom at night so bright they throw hard shadows across the dock, and the harbour becomes a factory floor where sleep is taken in stolen minutes and coffee is a form of fuel. Officers walk the deck with grease pencils marking priorities. Restore essential systems first, patch what must be patched, defer what can wait, and accept that the ship will go back to war with scars still fresh under her paint. You can feel the pressure in the way men speak. Short sentences, no wasted motion. Because every hour shaved off repairs is an hour added to the distance Yorktown can steam toward Midway. And somewhere, far across the Pacific, Japanese planners are making their own assumptions based on what they believe damage means. A carrier that took hits at Coral Sea should be out of action, sidelined, removed from the next fight. They expect fewer American decks on the line. In dry dock number 1, that expectation becomes the enemy too, and the yard answers it with sparks, torchlight, and the relentless American talent for turning labor into combat power. By the 3rd day, as exhausted men wipe soot from their faces and inspectors sign off on what's good enough to fight, the impossible begins to look real. Yorktown is not healed, but she is alive, seaworthy, and dangerously close to ready. May 29th to 30th, 1942. Pearl Harbor Navy Yard to open Pacific. By the second night in dry dock number 1, Yorktown doesn't feel like a ship so much as a living patient under floodlights, steam venting in white breaths, welding arcs flashing like lightning, the clang of hammers echoing through her ribs, while Captain Elliot Buckmaster moves through the noise with a face that gives nothing away. Because if he lets the exhaustion show, the whole illusion of control might crack. Down in the machinery spaces, engineers bring boilers up carefully, listening for vibrations and leaks the way a doctor listens for a bad heart rhythm. Topside, electricians trace damaged runs, restoring power where a single severed line could cripple a radar set or a pump at the worst moment. Flight deck crews patch and reinforce the skin of the ship so planes can land and launch without tearing open fresh wounds. And in the hangar deck, the smell is paint, cordite residue, and hot metal. Men grinding jagged edges, clearing debris, rigging temporary fixes that must hold under the violence of carrier operations. The yard's priorities are brutal and simple. Stop flooding risks, restore essential propulsion and steering reliability, make the flight deck and elevators function, ensure aviation fuel systems are safe enough to use, and accept that some non-critical systems will go to sea imperfect because time is the enemy now. Buckmaster hears the same phrase again and again from foremen and inspectors. It'll hold. And in peacetime, that would sound like laziness. In war, it sounds like salvation. On the morning of May 30th, as the last inspections run and signatures go onto forms that feel too ordinary for what they authorize, Yorktown is flooded out of dry dock and tugged back into the harbour channel. Sailors line the rail and look down at patched plating and fresh weld seams, dark scars on grey paint, and they understand that the ship is going back to fight on borrowed engineering. Admiral Nimitz has already made the decision that will haunt and define everyone involved. Yorktown will sail now, not when she is perfect, because Midway is coming and the fleet needs every flight deck it can muster. The men in the yard watch her move as if they're watching their own work step into gunfire. Out past the harbour mouth, the Pacific opens wide and indifferent, and as Yorktown's bow lifts into open water, the ship's internal noises shift, machinery settling into the steady thrum of transit, ventilation fans humming, metal cooling and warming as the hull flexes, while Buckmaster and his officers begin the next kind of repair, the at-sea kind, the kind done with limited tools and no margin for mistakes. In the ready rooms, pilots and aircrew, men who can smell how recently the ship was burned, strap on gear and talk in low voices about what the yard did, what it didn't do, and what that means if they take another hit. No one says the word fragile, but everyone feels it in the way they step around patched sections and listen to unfamiliar rattles that might be nothing or might be the first warning of failure. And far away, on the Japanese side, assumptions are hardening into confidence. Yorktown was damaged at Coral Sea, therefore Yorktown is not a factor at Midway, an expectation that will shape planning and timing, and the kind of arrogance that gets men killed. Yorktown steams west with fresh paint still tacky in places and welds still warm in memory, and as the horizon swallows Hawaii behind her, the carrier's crew carries a single, sharp understanding. They are not sailing as a restored ship. They are sailing as a calculated gamble, one held together by 72 hours of impossible labor, intended to appear in the enemy's sight like a ghost that refuses to stay dead. June 2nd to 3rd, 1942. North Pacific, east of Midway Atoll. The air out here has a colder bite than the Coral Sea ever did, and Yorktown's steel feels tighter in it, plates contracting, joints creaking, the patched sections of her hull talking back in little groans as she drives through a grey swell under a hard, indifferent sky. On the bridge, Captain Elliot Buckmaster watches the sea with the calm of a man who knows the ship is seaworthy because hundreds of exhausted hands forced her to be. But he also knows every new vibration is a question. Is that a normal flex or a wound reopening? Below deck, repair parties keep moving even while the ship steams, checking shoring, tightening fittings, watching for seepage, because the carrier is running on a margin measured in hours and faith. In the ready rooms, aircrew study maps and intelligence summaries that feel almost too blunt. The Japanese are coming for Midway, and the US Navy is going to meet them not with a fleet battle line, but with an ambush built around carriers, code breaks, and timing. You can feel how the plan depends on the enemy believing a comforting lie that America can only bring two carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, because Yorktown should still be crippled at Pearl. Out on the flight deck, the wind is sharp and the deck crews move with the same ritual speed as always, but now there's an extra edge in their motions, a sense that every landing and launch is not just practice, it's a test of whether the yard's 72-hour miracle holds under real carrier tempo. Yorktown's air group, still bruised from Coral Sea, runs drills and checks, Wildcats and Dauntlesses and Devastators cycling in patterns that never stop, pilots tightening straps, gunners checking mounts, armorers loading bombs with hands that work from muscle memory. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Max Leslie, Yorktown's dive bomber commander, walks among his men with the focused quiet of someone who already knows there's a good chance not all of them will come back. He doesn't need to say it, because the cold wind and the empty horizon say it for him. On the task force circuits, you can hear the larger machine coming together. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, in tactical command, moves his carriers like chess pieces, Yorktown with Task Force 17, and Enterprise and Hornet under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance in Task Force 16, seeking a position northeast of Midway where they can strike first. The ship's radios carry clipped messages, bearings, speed changes, the controlled language of a fleet trying not to announce itself to submarines and scout planes. Below, the men in engineering spaces sweat in a world of heat and noise, keeping the turbines singing because speed is life now. A carrier that can't maneuver is a target, and Yorktown's crew knows what a bomb feels like when it finds you. Then, on June 3rd, the first signs come in from Midway. Search reports, distant contacts, proof that the enemy is real, moving, and close enough now that every man aboard can feel the future tightening like a fist. In Fletcher's plotting rooms, the staff runs through possibilities with a bluntness that borders on fatalism. If the Japanese find the carriers first, they will strike hard. If the US carriers strike first, they might shatter the enemy's strength in minutes. And threaded through all of it is the psychological weapon Yorktown represents. An extra flight deck the Japanese didn't plan for, an extra set of fighters to protect the strike, an extra group of dive bombers waiting to fall out of the sun. On the evening of June 3rd, as the carrier steams in radio silence under a paling sky, Buckmaster steps out and looks across the darkening sea, imagining the enemy commanders somewhere over the horizon, making their own comfortable calculations. 2 American carriers, at most. He turns back toward the glow of the island lights and the low murmur of men preparing aircraft, and he knows the moment of shock is coming. The moment when Japanese lookouts and staff officers will see 3 American flat tops, where they expected 2, and realize that Yorktown, the ship they assumed was out of the war, has returned to fight with scars still fresh. June 4th, 1942. Dawn over the Philippine Sea approaches northeast of Midway, and the light comes in thin and cold, turning the carrier decks into pale runways floating on slate-colored water. On Yorktown, the morning begins the way carrier mornings always do. Engines coughing alive, deck crews moving with rehearsed speed, pilots walking with helmets tucked under arms as if their bodies are trying to pretend this is routine. But everyone feels the difference in the air. The way silence between orders is thicker because the enemy is close enough now that every minute is a doorway. In the flag plot, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher watches reports slide in like knives. Midway has made contact. Japanese carriers are out there. The first enemy strike is already in motion toward the atoll. Up on Yorktown's flight deck, Wildcats are launched into the grey in quick succession. Combat air patrol climbing to meet a threat still invisible, and below them dauntless dive bombers are armed and spotted, their crews waiting for the one piece of information that matters, where the Japanese carriers are. Then the radio crackles with urgency as scout reports and bearings begin to align into a picture. Enemy carriers to the northwest. On the Japanese side, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's staff is working inside its own assumptions. turning intelligence and doctrine into a plan built on a comforting belief. America may have two carriers, but not three. Yorktown was damaged at Coral Sea and should be in dock. That belief shapes everything: the expected weight of the American counterstrike, the allocation of cap fighters, the speed of decision-making in those first crucial minutes. And then reality intrudes. As Japanese scouts and radio intercepts sharpen, as flight deck crews on Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu cycle aircraft, the intelligence picture becomes unsettling. Multiple American carrier groups, more fighters in the air than expected, more radio traffic, more deck signatures in the direction they didn't plan for. It's not that someone aboard Nagumo's flagship sees a name painted on a hull. It's the colder shock of systems colliding. Three separate sources telling you the same impossible thing. Yorktown has joined Enterprise and Hornet, and the US is stronger than your math allowed. Out over the sea, Yorktown's VF-3 Wildcats, men like Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thack, who has been thinking for months about how to survive against Zeros, are already climbing into the thin air, scanning for specks that might be enemy scouts or incoming strikes. The fighter's engines drone steady, and the pilot's eyes hurt from staring into glare and haze, because the first man to see the enemy is the first man who gets to choose. The sky begins to fill with small, desperate shapes. Midway-based torpedo planes and bombers returning battered. Distant contrails. Flak bursts over the horizon where the enemy has hit the atoll. Then the carrier strike phase begins in earnest. Yorktown launches her own attack groups, Dauntlesses and Devastators, pushing off the deck into a cold wind that slaps at wings, climbing and forming up as the ocean stretches blank beneath them. While those strike aircraft race toward the enemy, the ship itself becomes a loaded spring, braced for the Japanese counterpunch because everyone aboard knows what happens next. Once you reveal your position by launching, you invite the enemy's aircraft to come looking. As reports stream back, enemy carriers spotted, course changes, Japanese CAP aloft, Fletcher's world narrows to decisions measured in minutes. And somewhere far ahead, as Yorktown's dive bombers close in on Nagumo's carriers, and Japanese officers struggle to reconcile an American force larger than expected, the ghost ship finally delivers the first real shock of the 72-hour miracle. Yorktown isn't just present. She's throwing aircraft into the fight at the exact moment the enemy least expected her to exist at all. June 4th, 1942. Late morning, high over the Pacific northwest of Midway. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell "Max" Leslie leads Yorktown's Scouting 6 and Bombing 3. Dauntlesses at altitude with his oxygen mask biting into his face, eyes stinging from hours of glare and tension, and below him, the Japanese carrier force finally sharpens into reality. Grey decks cutting white wakes, the neat geometry of a fleet that still believes it controls the sky. The radio is a hiss of short calls and static, but you can hear the urgency in every clipped word. Fuel states, enemy CAP sightings, scattered reports of torpedo squadrons being cut to pieces. Leslie has already received fragments of what Enterprise and Hornet's torpedo men endured. VT-8 and VT-6, diving, in low and straight, under a storm of Zeros and flak. And the knowledge tightens his stomach because it means one thing. The Japanese fighters are down low, distracted, burning altitude and speed, and the carriers themselves are at their most vulnerable. He banks the Dauntless slightly, keeping the sun behind him like a weapon, and for a moment, the ocean looks deceptively calm. Then he sees it. Flight decks cluttered with aircraft, wings folded, hoses and carts, bombs and torpedoes in motion, the very picture of a carrier in the dangerous middle of rearming. It's the kind of snapshot Japanese commanders never wanted an American to see, and for a heartbeat Leslie understands the larger ambush taking shape. Code breaks, timing, sacrifice, before it collapses back into the immediate, brutal task of putting bombs onto steel. He rolls in. The SBD's nose drops, the world tilts, and the dive becomes a violent tunnel of wind and vibration. The perforated dive breaks howling like a siren. Flak blossoms upward in black bursts, Not close enough to kill yet, but close enough to feel in the gut, and tracer fire reaches up from the escorts like needles. Leslie's gloved hand steadies the stick, and the Japanese carrier Soryu fills his windscreen. Deck markings, aircraft shapes, men running like ants, so crisp it looks unreal. At around 1,500 feet, he releases, the bomb dropping away as the Dauntless shudders, and then he hauls back, pulling out hard, the G-force crushing him into the seat as he skims above the carrier's wake. Behind him, other Yorktown Dauntlesses strike almost together, 3, maybe more. Each hit a hammer blow that turns a flight deck into a furnace. You can see the first orange bloom, then the darker smoke, then secondary explosions that kick debris upward as gasoline and ordnance find each other in the worst possible way. The Japanese formation, so ordered a minute earlier, suddenly looks like a wounded animal. Soryu slowing, smoke pouring, escort circling tighter, while overhead, the American dive bombers scatter and reform, their pilots hardly daring to look back because the only safe way out is speed and altitude. Leslie's gunner swings his twin .30 at a zero that flashes past, too fast to track, and the enemy fighter's presence is a reminder. The battle is not finished, it has only shifted. Far away, on Nagumo's flag plot, staff officers now face the unthinkable reality in flames. Carriers hit at the exact moment their decks are most crowded, their aircraft most vulnerable, their fighter cover pulled down into the low-altitude slaughter they expected to win, and Yorktown, the carrier they assumed would still be broken open at Pearl, has just helped deliver the decisive cut. On Yorktown's deck, Buckmaster and the ship's company feel the victory only as a brief tightening of hope, because even as reports come in that enemy carriers are burning, lookouts are already scanning for the inevitable counterstrike from the one Japanese deck still capable of launching it. Hiryu. And the patched, hurriedly repaired Yorktown braces herself for the moment the enemy finally aims directly at the ghost that shouldn't exist. June 4th, 1942. Early afternoon, northeast of Midway. The wind over Yorktown's deck is still hard and cold, but now it carries a different taste. Cordite from her own guns, faint smoke from distant burning carriers, and the metallic tang of fear that comes when you know the enemy's next move is already airborne. On the bridge, Captain Elliot Buckmaster receives the report everyone dreaded and expected. Japanese aircraft inbound, launched from the one surviving carrier, Hiryu. The ship's speakers crackle. "General quarters, man your battle stations!" And the deck crews scatter into practiced positions while the ship turns into the wind, trying to give its fighters every advantage and its gunners the clearest arcs. Above, Yorktown's combat air patrol wildcats climb and spread, tiny specks in a huge sky, and for a few minutes the whole battle compresses into a single question. Can the fighters break the strike before it reaches the ship? The first wave comes in low and fast. Dive bombers, Aichi D-3A Vals, their wings rocking as they weave through flak bursts that blossom like black flowers. Anti-aircraft guns open in layers, 5-inch, 1.1-inch Chicago pianos, .50 calibers, everything that can throw steel upward, and the air fills with smoke puffs, tracers, and the harsh, continuous roar of gunfire. From the deck, you see attackers fall, one Val catching fire, rolling into the sea, but you also see the ones that keep coming, their pilots committed with the desperate clarity of men who know their carrier force is dying, and this is their one chance to kill an American flat top before the day ends. A Val breaks through the curtain and drops into its plunge, the dive sirens screaming, and men on deck instinctively flatten as if steel can protect them from gravity and explosives. The bomb falls and the impact is immediate and brutal. Yorktown shudders as if struck by a giant fist. Then another hit follows, then another near miss that throws water up over the deck edge. Smoke pours across the flight deck. Fires ignite. Damage control parties run toward the heat without hesitation. Foam hoses whipping, axes and shoring timber ready. men disappearing into smoke the way infantry disappear into a tree line under fire. Buckmaster feels the ship's response through the deck plates. How she lists, how she slows, how systems flicker. And he knows exactly what everyone fears, that the hurried 72-hour repairs will now be tested by fresh violence. In engineering spaces, men fight to keep steam pressure steady, to keep power on, to keep pumps working. Reports come up, flight deck damaged, elevators jammed, casualties, fires, but the ship is still alive, and that matters. Then the second wave arrives before the first problem is fully solved. Japanese torpedo bombers, Nakajima B-5N Kates, skimming low over the sea with torpedoes slung beneath their bellies like predatory teeth. Wildcats slash down to intercept, and for seconds the fight is knife-close over the water, traces stitching through spray. Some attackers go down, but others press in, running straight and low to drop at the right distance, their pilots ignoring flak that rips the air around them. The torpedoes enter the water with a clean splash that looks almost gentle compared to what follows, and then the ship's fate becomes a matter of seconds and angles. Rudder hard over, engines answering, the carrier trying to comb the tracks. One torpedo hits. The impact is deep and sickening, a concussion that travels through the hull like a hammer strike into bone. The ship lurches. Lights flicker. A new list develops as flooding begins. And in that instant, Yorktown feels less like a warship and more like a wounded animal fighting to stay upright. Damage control teams move in again, shutting watertight doors, counter-flooding, rigging pumps, doing the brutal math of sacrifice. Flood this space to save that one, seal this compartment even if men are trapped, keep the ship afloat at any cost, because if she sinks now, everything the yard did in 72 hours becomes a footnote drowned in the Pacific. For a moment, the Japanese have what they wanted. Yorktown appears mortally hurt, dead in the water, listing, smoke drifting. On Hiryu, Japanese officers looking through binoculars begin to believe the comforting story has returned. Yorktown is finished after all. But then something happens that shocks even men who know the ship. The list stabilizes, engines respond, the ship slows but does not die, and the American crew keeps fighting the ship back to life, one valve, one pump, one hose line at a time. The ghost carrier refuses to sink quickly, and that refusal buys time. Time for other American carriers to strike Hiryu, time for the battle's decisive balance to lock in. Yorktown will not escape unpunished, but in this moment she has already fulfilled the purpose of the 72-hour miracle. She absorbed blows that might have ended the fight if she hadn't been there, and she did it while proving to Japanese commanders that an American carrier, written off as sunk, could return and still take hits in the middle of the most important carrier battle of the war. June 4th, 1942. Late afternoon into night, northeast of Midway. After the torpedo hits, Yorktown's decks feel subtly wrong underfoot, angled, vibrating unevenly, as if the ship is trying to remember how to be level while men fight the ocean in the dark below. Buckmaster's voice stays steady on the bridge, but the reports rising from engineering are the kind that strip optimism down to math. Flooding spreading, power unreliable, pumps straining, list increasing, and the carrier's speed falling away until she's barely making way, a wounded giant bleeding momentum. Damage control parties work with a stubborn discipline that borders on defiance, shoring bulkheads, rigging portable pumps, counter-flooding to correct the list. Yet every gain is paid for in sweat, smoke, and seconds, and the ship's own systems are a maze of compromised lines and strained machinery. For a brief, almost miraculous window, Yorktown steadies. The list is reduced, the engines answer enough to give the impression she might be saved, and on Hiryu the Japanese believe they have finally killed her, only to watch their own carrier burn under American dive bombers as the battle turns irrevocably against them. But Yorktown's reprieve is fragile. As evening approaches, the flooding worsens, the list grows again, and Buckmaster faces the decision every carrier captain dreads because it isn't about tactics. It's about the lives trapped inside steel. he orders non-essential men off the ship. Then, as stability fails, the words nobody wants to hear crackle through the ship. Prepare to abandon ship. The announcement moves like a cold wave through passageways where men have lived and fought for months. Sailors pause for a heartbeat, then shift into procedure, passing life jackets, lowering lines, helping wounded, carrying those who can't move fast enough. On the flight deck, the wind has an eerie emptiness now without aircraft running, and the sea alongside looks too calm for what it's taking. Destroyers and cruisers move in close, boats are lowered, and men go over the side in controlled groups, climbing down nets and lines, splashing into water that feels like an insultingly ordinary temperature for a moment this historic. Buckmaster is among the last to leave, the kind of act that isn't heroic in the cinematic sense, but is expected, necessary. He has to see the ship emptied, has to know he didn't leave men behind in sealed compartments. When he steps onto a destroyer's deck and looks back, Yorktown sits there in the twilight, smoking lightly, listing but still afloat, a carrier that by all the rules should have rolled over already. And the sight is almost supernatural. A sunk ship refusing to sink. Through the night and into June 5th, the Navy tries to save her anyway. Tugs and salvage parties move in, lines are rigged, pumps are brought aboard, and for a moment it seems possible that the yard's 72-hour miracle might be followed by another miracle at sea. Keep her afloat, tow her, patch her, bring her back to a dock somewhere. But the Pacific has its own predators. On June 6th, as USS Hammond lies alongside providing power and pumps and men, the Japanese submarine I-168 slips into the screen with the quiet patience submariners are trained to worship. It finds the wounded carrier like a shark finds blood. Torpedoes streak in. One slams into Hammond, ripping the destroyer apart in a violent, sudden explosion that throws debris and bodies into the air. Others strike Yorktown, reopening wounds the crew barely managed to control. The sea around the ships becomes chaos. Oil, smoke, men in the water, stunned survivors clinging to wreckage. While Yorktown's list increases again, finally pushing the carrier beyond the thin margin that salvage and discipline can hold. Over the next day, she lingers, bow rising and falling slowly, smoke trailing, the empty deck silent, until the morning of June 7th, 1942, when the carrier finally gives in and rolls into the Pacific, sliding under with a long, reluctant grace that feels like the last breath of a ship that refused to die on schedule. The Japanese never see the sinking directly, but the effect is the same. The belief that Yorktown was finished at Coral Sea was wrong, and the belief that she was finished at Midway required a submarine's stealth to make true, proof that the American carrier they wrote off once came back in 72 hours, fought, absorbed the counterstrike, and helped break Japan's carrier power before the ocean finally claimed her. In the days after June 7th, 1942, the Pacific feels oddly silent around the surviving ships, as Task Force 17 and Task Force 16 turn back towards safer waters. Decks scarred, air groups depleted, men moving through passageways with the tired, stunned look of people who have watched history happen too fast to process. On the destroyers and cruisers that picked up Yorktown's crew, the men sit wrapped in blankets, coughing salt water and smoke, replaying the sounds that will stick forever. The scream of dive bomber sirens over the Coral Sea, the hammer blow of bombs on June 4th, the deep, sickening thud of torpedo hits, and then the nightmare punctuation of I-168's attack. Hammond shattered, the sea suddenly full of bodies. Yet amid the grief, another current runs through every conversation like an electrical hum. Yorktown shouldn't have been there at all. She was assessed at Pearl Harbor as needing about 2 weeks of repairs. Any normal Navy, any normal shipyard schedule, would have left her in dock while Midway happened without her. Instead, Pearl Harbor's yard and Yorktown's crew compressed weeks into roughly 72 hours, patching, welding, restoring essential systems, accepting imperfection. And that decision didn't just produce a ship. It produced a third flight deck at the exact moment the United States needed a third flight deck to make the ambush work. That is the shockwave that travels beyond the sinking. Midway's victory is often told as code breaks and courage, and it is, but it also rests on logistics and repair speed, on the ability to turn damage into fighting power before the enemy can cash in on their assumptions. For the Japanese, the 72-hour turnaround is a strategic betrayal of expectation. Their planners entered Midway believing the United States could field at most 2 carriers. That belief shaped their confidence, their timing, and the way Nagumo's force cycled aircraft and cap in those crucial hours. When Yorktown appears, it doesn't just add aircraft, it complicates the enemy's picture. It increases the number of fighter sections to defend American carriers. It increases the number of dive bombers that can find and hit targets. It increases the chances that at least one American strike will arrive at the decisive moment when Japanese decks are crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. Even more, Yorktown's presence changes how the Japanese interpret the battle as it unfolds. They believe they have hit all American carriers. They believe they have eliminated the threat. And yet more American aircraft keep appearing because the American carrier force is larger than their certainty allowed. That uncertainty, even in a fleet as disciplined as Nagumo's, is poison. For the Americans, Yorktown's story becomes something different. Proof that the Navy Yard at Pearl Harbor is no longer a crippled victim of December 7th, but a weapon in its own right. An industrial lifeline capable of turning around a fleet carrier at impossible speed. Men who worked those 72 hours, welders, electricians, riggers, pipe fitters, rarely appear in heroic paintings, but their labor directly influenced the combat power available at Midway. Yorktown's crew feels that truth in their bones. They sailed west on a ship held together by patches, and those patches held long enough for her to launch aircraft, help strike Soryu, absorb Hiryu's counterstrike, and stay afloat long enough to keep the American carrier screen viable until Hiryu was destroyed. The final irony is that Yorktown did die, but she died after she had already done the job the enemy assumed she couldn't do: show up, fight, and change the battle's math. When the US Navy rebuilds and pushes west in 1943 and 1944, Yorktown's 72-hour return becomes part of the institutional memory, a lesson that repair speed, logistics, and disciplined damage control can be as decisive as torpedoes and bombs. It's a story of steel and schedules, of men who measure time in weld seams and hose pressure, and of a moment when Japanese commanders looked at their calculations and realized the Americans had found a way to bring a sunk ship back to war, fast enough to shock them, and long enough to help break the axis of the Pacific conflict.